thoughts are drowned by the beating of my heart.
You hear, Memnit? The whole city calls his name.
70 years ago, a film parted the waters of cinema history and never looked back. A cast of Hollywood legends gathered under the blazing Egyptian sun created something that was never just entertainment. It was an event, a monument, the kind of filmmaking the world may never see again. But time moves without mercy, even for the immortal. And today, the question that lingers is not whether you remember their faces. You do. The question is what became of them when the cameras finally stopped rolling. Hi, my name is Edward, and this is Screen Legends, Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston was 32 years old when Cecil B. DeMille cast him as Moses. 32, which, when you think about it, is almost absurd. Because from the moment he appeared on screen, white-robed and burning-eyed, descending from Sinai with the weight of a divine law written across his face, there was nothing young about him. He carried the role the way stone carries an inscription, permanently, unmistakably, as though it had always been there. Moses was not simply a character Heston played. It became the lens through which the entire world understood him, a man chosen against his own comfort, a leader forged through exile, grief, and an encounter with something far beyond human explanation. When he stretched that staff over the Red Sea, audiences did not merely watch a special effect, they believed. And that belief was entirely Heston's doing, because beneath the parted waters and the towering set pieces was an actor giving everything he had with quiet, almost frightening conviction. What followed Moses was a career of extraordinary range and sustained prestige. Ben-Hur, in 1959, brought him the Academy Award for Best Actor. Planet of the Apes, in 1968, proved he could carry science fiction with the same gravitas he brought to ancient epics. He worked with the greatest directors of his generation. He marched in civil rights demonstrations alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 1960s, a fact that is sometimes overlooked in the retelling of his story. He was not a man who stood to one side while history moved. In his later years, Heston became president of the National Rifle Association, a role that made him one of the most debated public figures in America. Supporters saw him as a principled defender of constitutional rights. Critics saw something else entirely. The truth, as it usually does, lives somewhere in between. But whatever your politics, no one could deny that he brought to that position the same unflinching commitment he brought to every role. The man simply did not know how to do anything halfway. In 2002, Heston publicly announced that he had been diagnosed with symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. He stood before the cameras one final time and delivered that news with a dignity so complete it silenced the room. He passed away on the 5th of April, 2008, at the age of 84, at his home in Beverly Hills. He left behind a legacy so large that even 70 years later, it is nearly impossible to stand at its full edge and see where it ends. Yul Brynner, Ramesses II. Yul Brynner was 35 years old when he stepped in front of the camera as Ramesses II, the proud and unbending pharaoh of Egypt. And here is something worth pausing on. In the same year, 1956, Brynner also won the Academy Award for Best Actor for The King and I, the same year. One man, two towering performances, on different sides of the moral universe. That is not a career highlight. That is a statement. As Ramesses, Brynner brought something that no costume or lighting could manufacture. He brought stillness, a coiled, dangerous stillness that made every scene between him and Heston feel like two immovable forces pressing silently against each other. Where Moses burned with divine purpose, Ramesses burned with wounded pride. And Brynner understood that a man who cannot admit he is wrong is, in his own way, just as tragic as the people he oppresses. That complexity made Ramesses more than a villain. It made him human. Brynner was born in Russia, raised across multiple countries, spoke several languages, and carried an air of complete geographic mystery that he apparently cultivated with some deliberate enjoyment. He was, by most accounts, a fascinating and slightly maddening person to work with. Intense on set, enormously charismatic off it, the kind of performer other actors studied from a careful distance. His stage career ran parallel to his film work and outlasted it in some ways. He returned to The King and I on Broadway multiple times across the decades, ultimately performing the role of the King of Siam more than 4,600 times over the course of his life. 4,600 times, 6. I need you to sit with that number for a moment. That is not dedication. That is devotion of an almost spiritual order. In the final chapter of his life, Brynner was diagnosed with lung cancer, and in an act of remarkable selflessness, he recorded a public service announcement that was broadcast after his death, in which he looked directly into the camera and told viewers, simply and plainly, not to smoke. It became one of the most powerful anti-smoking messages in television history. He passed away on the 10th of October, 1985, at the age of 65. The announcement aired the very next day. Even in death, he found a way to hold the room. Anne Baxter, Nefertiti.
Listen, Mehmet. Listen.
Anne Baxter was 33 years old when she took on the role of Nefertiti, the Egyptian princess whose love for Moses becomes an obsession that ultimately destroys her. And if you have seen the film, you already know what I mean when I say she did not play that role quietly. Nefertiti arrives on screen like a flame that has decided it wants to be a wildfire, passionate, calculating, furious, heartbroken, and utterly compelling from the first scene to the last. What made Baxter's performance so remarkable was the layering. Nefertiti is not simply a jealous woman. She is a person watching the entire architecture of her life collapse around her, powerless to stop it, and too proud to look away. Baxter understood that kind of pain instinctively. She played it not with hysteria, but with a burning, barely contained grief that made Nefertiti genuinely tragic rather than merely difficult. Baxter had already proven herself one of Hollywood's finest, long before the desert sands of the Ten Commandments. Her performance in All About Eve in 1950 brought her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, a film so perfectly constructed that it remains one of the most quoted and studied in cinema history. She was in extraordinary company in that film, and she held her own completely. After the Ten Commandments, her film career continued steadily through the late 1950s and into the 60s, though the great leading roles became less frequent as the industry shifted around her. She moved into television with intelligence and grace, never treating the smaller screen as a lesser one, and earned strong recognition for her work there. She even joined the cast of Dynasty in its early 1980s run, which I mention partly because it's remarkable and partly because I think she deserves credit for adapting with more elegance than most. Anne Baxter passed away on the 12th of December, 1985, at the age of 62, following a brain aneurysm she suffered while hailing a cab in New York City. The suddenness of it was cruel in the way that real loss often is. She left behind a body of work that deserves far more regular conversation than it currently receives. Edward G. Robinson, Dathan.
Agreed. The deliverer is Moses.
Edward G. Robinson was 62 years old when he appeared in the Ten Commandments as Dathan, the conniving overseer who betrays his own people for personal gain. 62 years old, and still one of the most watchable people on screen in every single scene he inhabited. That is not common. That is a gift that very few performers carry into the later decades of their lives, and Robinson carried it effortlessly. Robinson had been a Hollywood giant since the 1930s. His role as Rico in Little Caesar in 1931 essentially created the blueprint for the American gangster film. For 2 decades, he was one of the most recognized faces in the world, and then, in the early 1950s, the world turned on him. During the McCarthy era and the Hollywood blacklist, Robinson was named as a suspected communist sympathizer. He was never charged with anything. He was never found guilty of anything. But the accusation alone was enough to damage his career, freeze his momentum, and force him into a series of humiliating testimonies before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he was made to prove his patriotism to men who were, by most historical assessments, using fear as a political instrument. It was a dark chapter for him and for the industry. His casting in the Ten Commandments was, in some ways, a restoration, a return to major studio filmmaking at the highest level, and he repaid that trust with a performance of tremendous sly intelligence. Dathan is the kind of villain who never raises his voice because he never needs to. Robinson understood that perfectly. His final film, was Soylent Green in 1973, in which he appeared alongside Charlton Heston one last time, decades after the sands of Egypt. Robinson passed away on the 26th of January 1973 at the age of 79, just days after completing that final performance. He received an honorary Academy Award that same year. They gave it to him just in time, which is either poetic or a lesson Hollywood never quite learned. Yvonne De Carlo, Sephora.
Can a man judge God? No, Moses.
Yvonne De Carlo was 33 years old when she took on the role of Sephora, the Midianite woman who becomes Moses' devoted and quietly strong wife. And here is something worth understanding about that role. In a film overflowing with spectacle, burning bushes, parted seas, and furious pharaohs, Sephora is asked to do something far more difficult. She is asked to be still, to be warm, to be the steady human ground beneath a man being pulled toward the divine. That is not the flashiest assignment in the production, but without it, Moses has no anchor. He is simply a man shouting at the sky. De Carlo understood exactly what the role required and delivered it with a natural, unforced grace that made every scene feel lived in rather than performed. Where Nefertiti burns, Sephora endures, and endurance, done well, is its own kind of power. What most people of a certain generation remember about Yvonne De Carlo, however, has absolutely nothing to do with the parting of the Red Sea. They remember Lily Munster. From 1964 to 1966, De Carlo played the elegant, warm-hearted, and delightfully ghoulish matriarch of the Munsters, floating through that gloriously strange household in a white streak and a Victorian gown, and somehow making the whole thing feel like a perfectly reasonable way to raise a family. She brought genuine comedic timing and an extraordinary sweetness to Lily that audiences responded to immediately and completely. The role attached itself to her public identity with a grip that never loosened. From the devoted wife of a prophet to the devoted wife of a Frankenstein. As career reinventions go, I have to say, that one is difficult to top. What is far less discussed and deserves to be is how genuinely difficult De Carlo's later years became. Despite real stardom, despite two roles that lodged themselves permanently in the American cultural memory, she faced serious financial hardships through the 1980s. The royalties were not what they should have been. The leading roles had long since stopped arriving. She returned to the stage, accepted lower budget work, and kept showing up with a professionalism and warmth that the industry frankly did not always deserve from her. The entertainment world's tendency to discard actresses of a certain age, while the men beside them keep working, is a story told too rarely and too gently. Yvonne De Carlo's later years are an honest chapter of that story. She passed away on the 8th of January 2007 at the age of 84. And what strikes you, reading accounts of her final decades, is that despite everything, despite the financial strain and the faded spotlight and the industry's casual indifference, audiences never stopped being glad to see her. That kind of warmth cannot be manufactured. It cannot be managed or marketed or spun into existence. It comes from one place only. Decades of showing up and giving people something completely genuinely real. Deborah Paget, Deborah Paget was just 22 years old when she appeared in the Ten Commandments as Lilia, the Hebrew slave girl whose quiet dignity and suffering become one of the film's most emotionally direct threads. She was luminously beautiful in a way that the camera of that era seemed almost overwhelmed by, and she brought to Lilia a genuine vulnerability that made the character's ordeal feel genuinely painful to watch. Paget was already a recognizable name in Hollywood by the time she was cast. She had appeared alongside Elvis Presley in Love Me Tender in 1956, the same year as the Ten Commandments, which, again, is the kind of career overlap that makes you realize some people simply lived in the absolute center of a cultural moment, without always receiving full credit for it. What makes Deborah Paget's story different from most of the others on this list is what she chose to do with the second half of her life. She stepped away from Hollywood deliberately, quietly, and completely. She retreated into private life in Texas, raised her son, and lived largely away from the entertainment world that had made her famous. No dramatic comeback attempts, no reality television, no memoir designed to reclaim the spotlight. Just a person who made the extraordinary choice to live as a private citizen. And here is the remarkable part. As of 2026, Deborah Paggi is still with us at the age of 91. She is, to the best of our knowledge, one of the last surviving principal cast members of the 10 Commandments. 91 years old and living quietly, far from the flashbulbs that once followed her everywhere. There is something genuinely beautiful about that. A woman who gave the world her youth and then simply kept the rest for herself. John Derek, Joshua. John Derek was 29 years old when he appeared in the 10 Commandments as Joshua, the faithful young warrior who stands at Moses' side through the long walk toward the Promised Land. Derek was strikingly handsome in the way that 1950s Hollywood loved, the kind of face the camera seemed to organize itself around. And he brought an earnest physical presence to the role that suited the character's uncomplicated loyalty. His acting career, however, never quite reached the level that his early appearances seemed to promise. He worked steadily through the 1950s and into the 60s, but found himself gradually moving away from performing and toward photography and filmmaking. And it is here that John Derek's story takes a turn that is, depending on your perspective, either fascinating or rather a lot to process. Derek became significantly more famous in his later decades for the women he married than for his performances. He was married 4 times. To Patty Bears, to Ursula Andress, to Linda Evans, and finally to Bo Derek, whom he met when she was 16 years old and he was 45. He went on to direct her career, most notably in the film 10 in 1979, which made Bo Derek an international star. The age gap and the circumstances of their relationship attracted considerable commentary then, and would attract considerably more today. That is simply a fact worth noting plainly. John Derek passed away on the 22nd of May, 1998, at the age of 71. His obituaries spent as much time on his marriages as on his work, which is either a reflection of how his career ultimately unfolded, or a commentary on how we choose to remember people, perhaps both. Cedric Hardwicke, Sethi.
There is the obelisk of your jubilee. Baka.
Cedric Hardwicke was 61 years old when he appeared in the 10 Commandments as Sethi, the aging pharaoh whose quiet favoritism toward Moses sets the entire tragedy in motion. Hardwicke brought to the role the full weight of a life spent on the greatest stages of the English-speaking world. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a classical actor, the kind who makes an entrance into a room and, without raising his voice or making any particular effort, simply commands it. Hardwicke had been knighted by King George V in 1934, one of the first actors of the sound era to receive that honor. He was a figure of towering theatrical reputation long before Hollywood came calling. And when it did, he moved between stage and screen with the easy confidence of someone who understood that the fundamentals of great performance do not change depending on which medium you happen to be standing in. His contribution to the 10 Commandments is easy to underestimate, because Sethi does not survive long enough to drive the story forward, but the emotional architecture of everything that follows depends entirely on the choices he makes in the early scenes, and Hardwicke builds that foundation with a quiet mastery that rewards careful attention. The sadness in his eyes when he looks at Moses, the weight of a man who loves too many people in impossible directions, is entirely his own contribution. DeMille gave him the lines. Hardwicke gave them their gravity. Sir Cedric Hardwicke passed away on the 6th of August, 1964, at the age of 71. He remains one of the finest classical actors ever to appear in an American studio production. Vincent Price, Baka.
Delicate flower to be pressed between walls of stone.
Vincent Price was 44 years old when he appeared in the 10 Commandments as Baka, the cruel master builder who oversees the suffering Hebrew slaves with casual brutality. And I want to take a moment here because this is one of the more quietly delightful pieces of casting trivia in the film. The man who would go on to become the undisputed king of American horror cinema, the voice that could make a perfectly ordinary sentence feel like a death sentence, is here in Cecil B. DeMille's biblical epic, playing a villain in robes and sandals. It is frankly wonderful. Price was always a more complicated and more interesting performer than his horror reputation sometimes suggested. He was an art collector of genuine scholarly depth, holding degrees from Yale and the University of London. He was a passionate cook who published several well-regarded cookbooks. He was, by virtually all accounts, one of the warmest and most generous people in the film industry. Someone who treated every fan, every crew member, and every interviewer with the same unhurried courtesy. The menacing voice was real. The monster was not. After the 10 Commandments, Price entered his great creative flowering. House of Usher in 1960, The Pit and the Pendulum in 1961, The Mask of the Red Death in 1964, film after film after film, in which he took material that could easily have been ridiculous and elevated it through sheer commitment and extraordinary vocal presence into something genuinely memorable. In his final years, he battled Parkinson's disease and lung cancer, continuing to work for as long as his health permitted. His last significant role was in Edward Scissorhands in 1990, directed by Tim Burton, who idolized him. It was a gentle, warm, elegiac performance that felt like a goodbye from a man who had given the craft everything he had. Vincent Price passed away on the 25th of October, 1993, at the age of 82. The world became considerably less interesting that day. Martha Scott, Yochebel.
Take my child into thy hands, that he may live to thy service.
Martha Scott was 43 years old when she took on the role of Yochebel, the Hebrew mother who places the infant Moses into a basket on the Nile and watches him float away from her, knowing it is the only way to save his life. It is one of the most emotionally direct moments in the entire film, and Scott plays it with a stillness so complete, a grief so precisely contained, that it lands like a quiet blow every single time. Scott was one of those performers whose talent was acknowledged consistently and celebrated insufficiently. She received an Academy Award nomination for her very first film role, In Our Town, in 1940, which is the kind of debut that announces a major career, and she did go on to have a major career. She worked steadily for 6 decades across film, television, and stage, earning respect from everyone she worked with and a level of public recognition that never quite matched what those who knew her work understood her to be worth. There is something fitting about Martha Scott playing the mother of Moses. She possessed a quality of absolute moral warmth, the kind that does not need to announce itself, that was written into her presence as naturally as the color of her eyes. Yochebel's love for her child is not performed in Scott's hands. It simply exists. And in a film filled with enormous spectacle, that quiet human truth is one of the things that still makes the 10 Commandments genuinely moving, rather than merely impressive. After a final stretch of television appearances in the 1980s and 90s, Martha Scott passed away on the 28th of May, 2003, at the age of 90. A long life, a full life, and a body of work that deserves to be revisited with the kind of attention it earned and rarely received. As 70 years. That is how long it has been since Cecil B. DeMille gathered these extraordinary men and women together in the desert and asked them to make something that would last. And it did last. The 10 Commandments remains one of the most watched films in American television history, airing every year around Easter, with the kind of reliable permanence that very few cultural artifacts ever achieve. It has outlasted almost everyone who made it. Of the principal cast members we have visited tonight, nearly all are gone now. Heston, Brynner, Baxter, Robinson, DiCarlo, Derrick, Hardwick, Price, Scott. Each of them carried something irreplaceable, a quality of presence, a command of craft, a particular way of inhabiting a moment that cannot be manufactured and cannot be taught. They came from an era of filmmaking that demanded total physical and emotional commitment, where there were no digital corrections, no endless reshoots, where you simply showed up, knew your craft, and gave everything you had in the time you had to give it. And then there is Deborah Paget, 91 years old, living quietly in Texas, the young woman who stood in the sands of Egypt in 1956, who looked into a camera with those extraordinary eyes, and who then chose, decades ago, to simply live her life away from all of it. She is the last thread connecting us to that set, to that crew, to the living memory of what it felt like to be there. There is something profoundly humbling about that. We tell these stories on Screen Legends because we believe that the lives behind the performances deserve the same attention we give the performances themselves. That the real story does not end when the credits roll, that understanding where these people went, what they carried, what they lost, and what they chose, makes the films themselves richer and more honest. These were not icons, they were people. And people deserve to be remembered fully. If this journey through one of cinema's greatest monuments has meant something to you tonight, we warmly invite you to follow Screen Legends and join us for the next chapter. There are so many more stories waiting, and we are not done yet.